And may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight. For you are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So about 15 years ago, I was serving the little United Methodist Church in the town of Salida. Some of you may know the area. It's this beautiful little town surrounded by mountains right on the Arkansas River. It was a great place to live. And one day, just kind of out of nowhere, I got a call from the dean of the local community college. She called because the semester was starting in 2 weeks, and her philosophy instructor had suddenly got a job elsewhere and had to move out of town. Now, I guess I was the closest thing to a philosopher that she knew, and so she called to ask me if I could help out by teaching an introduction to philosophy course in 2 weeks. Now, I don't know if any of you used to listen to the car guys, those two guys on public radio. You know, they would answer questions about cars. They had this great kind of funny show. And they had a great phrase that I think describes so much of the way I live my life. They used to say that their answers to questions about cars were unencumbered by the thought process. Now, I'm about as qualified to teach a college philosophy course as I would have been to hold forth on 3D printing for space shuttle parts or the feeding habits of marine invertebrates, but unencumbered by the thought process and never having been one to let ignorance interfere with my utterly delusional level of self-confidence, I said, sure. I mean, it's philosophy. How hard could it be, right? I've done this all my life. I do this I do it all the time. I talk my way into things I don't actually have any idea at all how to do. And I know you're all going, that explains a lot, right? But one way that I've made this work is that I have a bunch of really smart friends. And when it comes to philosophy, a couple of my friends are the real deal. They're like actual college philosophy professors who have PhDs and write books about this stuff. So I called one of them up. There's this guy named Lou Matz. He teaches out at the University of the Pacific in California. And I explained, that's Lou. I explained the mess I had gotten myself into, and I asked for some suggestions. So Lou sent me out a syllabus for his intro course, some ideas for books I could use, that kind of stuff. But the most helpful thing that he did was to talk me through some of the discussion starters and exercises that he used in his classes. They've stuck with me to this day. One of them is about human freedom. And here's what Lou would do. He would start out the discussion by asking students to think of some moral choices that a person might have to make, some fairly clear ones. Suppose, for example, a person was threatening your family. Would you be willing to intervene physically to protect them? Or what if somebody was in the way of an oncoming train? Would you be willing to risk your own safety to pull that person off the tracks? Or let's suppose you had the chance to give food to someone who really needed it, someone who was on the verge of starvation, and if you gave them some of your food, you might not have all that you needed. Would you give them food? Or what would you do if a person said something to you that was just blatantly racist? Would you tell them that their attitude was wrong, that it was offensive? Now, predictably, all of his students would say, yeah, of course we would, yes. Of course we would protect our families. Of course we would give somebody food. Of course we would pull somebody out of the way of an oncoming train or shut down a blatant racist. Of course. So then Lou would push the question a little bit further. He would say, okay, what if you were confronted with one of those situations 100 times? Would you make the same choice every single time? The students would say, well, yeah, I mean, it's not like 2 times out of 100 I'm going to randomly decide not to protect my children, or 7 times out of 100 I'm going to randomly decide to go ahead and agree with some white supremacist nonsense. But then would come the point of the whole exercise. Lou would say to his students, okay, let me get this straight. If every time, 100 times out of 100, you would do exactly the same thing under the same conditions, then in what sense are you free? What makes you any different than a robot? You're mechanically programmed to respond in a completely predictable way. So it sounds like what you're saying is that under any of those conditions, you don't actually have free will. Is that what you're saying? Now, of course, my friend had led his students into a trap, right? In recent years, there's a whole field of study that has sprung up called choice architecture. And what the people who study this stuff tell us is that the choices we make depend on how our options are presented to us. So, in terms of choice architecture, my friend intentionally designed choices where there was really only one acceptable option. But his real purpose wasn't to get them to make choices. His real purpose was to bring up the conflict between these two different understandings of what it means to be free. The first one is probably the most common. When we say we're free, what we mean is we can choose to do whatever we want, right? As long as I'm not infringing on someone else's freedoms, as long as I'm not doing stuff like driving recklessly and endangering others or setting buildings on fire or whatever, I can do whatever I want. No one can stop me. I choose my speech, I choose my actions. That's one understanding of freedom. But there's another kind of freedom that I think is more important than that first one. It's the freedom to commit ourselves to the ideals that will define us, the freedom to decide what we want our lives to be about. And when we use that freedom, we have used our freedom to limit our options, because at that point we are committed to a greater purpose, something more important than the freedom to do whatever we want, whenever we want. A few minutes ago, we just heard this passage from Paul's letter to the churches in Galatia. Paul is writing to address the question of what it meant to be Christian in a church that was almost entirely made up of Gentiles, people who used to worship Roman gods before they decided they wanted to follow Jesus. See, in the very earliest years of the Christian movement, all Christians were Jews. They had decided to follow a Jewish Messiah, Jesus. But as the movement grew, Gentiles became attracted to it as well. These were people who had no Jewish history. They had no Jewish culture. They had no knowledge of Jewish scriptures or religious law or spiritual practice. So then a group of leaders arose in the Galatian churches who claimed that becoming Christian meant that you had to live by Jewish religious law. For them, inclusion in the people of God depended on living as Jews did. And according to these leaders, if you were unwilling to do that, you had to go. So a lot of them did. A lot of people left the church because they didn't want to live by a set of laws that had never made any sense to them anyway. They left because they were being told that unless they became a certain kind of people, then they weren't good enough to stay. They left because they were told that unless they behaved in the right ways, they weren't good enough to stay. They left because they were sick of arguing about something that should never have been a problem in the first place. The church had descended into tribalism. Jew against Gentile, us against them, we're right, they're wrong, we're good, they're evil. And if you don't think that's still going on in Christianity, might need to get out more. Now, Paul, in his response to all this, he does not exactly beat around the bush. He writes, "You foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? In Christ Jesus," he writes, "all of you are children of God through faith. There is no longer Jew nor Greek. There's no longer slave nor free. There's no longer male nor female. All of you are one in Christ Jesus." And then in the 5th chapter of the letter, Paul raises a question that is similar to the one that my friend Lou raised in his philosophy class. If we're free of the obligation to keep kosher and follow Jewish laws, then what does that freedom mean about how we are to live? Paul writes, "You were called to freedom, brothers and sisters. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for self-indulgence, but through love become slaves to one another. For the whole law is summed up in a single commandment: you shall love your neighbor as yourself." I don't know if you caught this, but for a first century Roman audience, this would have been an utterly shocking pronouncement. Paul is telling them to be slaves to each other. In the Roman Empire, slaves were viewed as completely dishonorable. Their entire lives were lived at the command of others. They had no control even over how their own bodies were used or abused or treated. No matter how trusted or how valued a slave might become, in Latin, They were referred to as instrumentum vocarum, speaking tools. A slave was just a hammer or a shovel that could talk. And that is Paul's bizarre description of how we should use our freedom. Become slaves to one another. Now, I don't think that Paul is recommending that we should consent to being abused. I don't think he's telling us that we shouldn't care how we treat people or how people treat us. I think instead, he's offering us a spiritual practice that will strengthen us when we come to those moments in our lives that we need to make the hard choice, to put aside our instinctive tribalism and fear, to step out of our obsessive need for self-gratification. In Philippians, Paul writes that Jesus did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited, but emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, being born in human likeness. Paul is describing an attitude of humility that was at the heart of Jesus' life, and he's recommending that it be at the heart of our own as we form a Christian community. That humility, that practice of humility, helps us learn to put aside our own egos and our desires and instead to serve as Christ served. The question that Paul raises, the question for our freedom, the question for our calling, is not a question of what we want to do at this moment. The question is what the world needs at this moment. Because in the end, there's something that Paul knew, and I think we all know it. In the end, if our lives are dedicated to that first kind of freedom, the freedom to pursue whatever we happen to desire at the moment, then we aren't free at all. Our lives just become an endless quest for the next thing we want, the next experience we're going to have, the shiny new toy, the next sweet taste in the mouth, the next 45 minutes of excitement. And that's not freedom. That's just slavery to our own desires. For Paul, the real question is not what we are free from, it's what we are free for. And the greatest purpose for which we could be free, Paul says, is to fulfill what Rev Mark has been telling us for the past few weeks, is the calling of all Christians, no matter who we are, for each in our own way to be formed in the image of Christ. Paul says that one way we do that is through this spiritual practice of service. And as we take on that practice, something begins to happen in us. We begin to break free from that endless thirst for the next shiny thing, that endless desire to be special and honored and recognized as superior and better. And gradually, day by day, we become more like Christ, more loving, more grounded in God. We begin to express, to manifest what Rev Mark called a few weeks ago in his sermon, the true self, which is the Christ Spirit that lives in and through each one of us. Service is the practice of that kind of Christ-like humility. Because what service does is bring us face to face with other people who have different lives and different needs and different experience than we do. Whether we are serving, I'll call her out, she's probably listening on the live stream right now, as serving as Judy Cox does, picking up those phone calls when people are complaining about the live stream and why it doesn't work, and by the way, this morning it's snow, that's why it doesn't work. Or whether we're going like Jen did with the group, our outreach and community life director, when she went down yesterday to the park and served mac and cheese to our friends without homes, and then the group went over to the Denver Rescue Mission and helped serve food there. Whatever kind of service we choose to do, we begin to be brought closer to God because we begin to be able to see the face of God in those we serve by turning to them and honoring them in our service. There's this theologian named William Schweiker who's written this great book called Theological Ethics and Global Dynamics. I promise it is not as boring as it sounds. In that book, he writes about what he calls moral madness, this insanity that we can see over the globe throughout history that periodically grips entire cultures or nations and allows them to justify utterly appalling evil through the conviction that they alone are right. Slavery is moral madness. The Nazi death camps, the Balkan War, the killing fields of Cambodia, the Rwandan massacres, they're all expressions of moral madness. And Schweiker says that moral madness is ultimately built on what he calls the logic of totality, which is to say, if someone criticizes anything I do, then they must hate everything about me, and they become my enemy. If someone opposes me in any way or is different than I am in any way, then they're a threat. Everything about them is evil. It's the logic of totality. We've all heard that kind of talk, right? Those people can't be reasoned with. Those people aren't interested in assimilating to our culture. Those people don't value life. Those people don't respect us. Those people hate everything we stand for. Those people are not even human. Those people want to destroy our way of life, and they must be stopped at any cost. The only good one is a dead one. It's the logic of totality, and we hear it in the voices of extremists all over the world. North Korea, Venezuela, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia. We even hear it here now and then in our own country. And when we are gripped by moral madness, then anything at all that we do to our enemies, or those we see as our enemies, can be justified. Schweiker tells us a story in that book, and it points toward a way to resist moral madness. It points to our call to serve. Schweiker writes about a young Marine captain, the son of devout Methodists in Iowa, fighting in the invasion of Okinawa during World War II. A few days after the invasion began, the captain was with his platoon on patrol, and he and several of his men entered a cave to look for any of the enemy who might be hiding there. And in the cave, they found a single Japanese soldier, wounded and dying, lying on the floor of the cave. Now, the Marines' blood was up. They had been fighting without break in one of the war's bloodiest battles for almost 2 days. Their first instinct was to kill the man, as Schweiker says, to finish the job, and then to take some war souvenirs off his uniform, off his body. But the captain stopped them and ordered his men out of the cave, and he knelt down and he held the Japanese soldier in his arms while he died. And Schweiker writes, in the eyes of an enemy who he had felt compelled to protect out of his own religious conviction, came a glimpse of shared humanity, a common dignity and a common destiny. In acts of goodness such as these, a new world is born, not of violence and warfare, but remade from within the bounty of life. Schweiker closes that story by revealing that the young Marine captain was his own father. How do we transcend tribal boundaries? How do we make Paul's words about being one people real and not just some gauzy idealistic dream that sounds great to recite on Sunday? How do we stand against the world's moral madness? How do we deal with a world that seems increasingly divided by hatred and misunderstanding and intentional ignorance? In the midst of even that world, of even this world, we can do this. We can turn to the person nearest us and say, how may I serve you? If we can learn to do that, we can provide a haven of kindness and hospitality in the world, and Christ will become